This review is for the last and final test in neuroanatomy, and I'm just going to go over briefly all of the structures and material that you should know. Now, you must read your notes carefully, and whenever you talk of any artery, you must know where the artery lies. So, in other words, its position, how it travels. For example, look at the vertebral artery traveling through the foramen transverse area. So, you must know which foramen transverse area it's traveling from through. You must know what it is a branch of and what are its branches. So this is extremely important. So you must know all its branches, what it is and what it itself is a branch of. If there's anything peculiar about the branches, notice how the anterior spinal artery is formed and how the posterior spinal arteries are formed, how many there are, any important thing like the artery of Adam Kiewicz. So it's important to know these structures. You must also know what areas are supplied by the spinal arteries. For example, here, the 2/3 is by the anterior spinal, then 1/3 is by the posterior spinal. How it is helped by these segmental arteries, what those travel through. So it's important for you to know about that. You must also know about the vertebral venous plexus and also the spinal plexus, which is around the spinal cord, how many channels there are. So again, that is important. Anything in relation to this, to the venous plexus, that too is extremely important for you to know. For example, up here, notice the connections of the vertebral venous plexus with the spine. It'll be connected to the spinal veins. It's connected to the basivertebral vein, and then to the veins outside in the pelvic organs, the veins of the pelvic organs. So again, very important to know that. Then here we have the arterial supply of the brain. So here you need to know how the circle of Willis is formed and what main blood vessels form the circle of Willis. And then you can see that in the circle, what are all the other arteries which take part up here. So you should know all of these arteries. You must know the branches of the vertebral. You must know branches of the internal carotid, and then of course all of these individual branches, and then you must know what areas they supply. And for that, let's go to the next picture. So you look up here, you can see that these are the areas supplied on the inferior surface. And while you're doing this, it's a good idea to also know what regions these are. For example, this area is the uncus, this area is the visual cortex. So you can see that up here. This is the olfactory bulb. So you can see that the olfactory bulb will be supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. So you notice all of these, the hippocampal gyrus, the parieto-occipital gyri, notice up here, supplied mainly by the posterior cerebral. So little things like this are extremely important. Then when you look at the supralateral surface, again, notice how these areas are supplied. So here you can see the visual cortex and the inferior temporal gyrus. This whole area is by the posterior cerebral. So this is by the posterior cerebral artery. This entire supralateral surface, which includes areas like, for example, you can see the Broca's speech area, the Wernicke's area up here, the gustatory area in the parietal lobe, the auditory area in the temporal lobe. All of this is the middle cerebral artery. And then also notice that up here there's just a thin strip which is supplied by the anterior cerebral, but remember the body is represented in an upside down fashion. So you can see that the legs and then the knee and the perineal area, which goes on the medial side up here. So you can see on the medial side up here, that is supplied by the anterior cerebral. So the leg area plus on the medial side, all of that. So if you got a question something like, let's say the person has paralysis of the upper limbs, so then you can see that it'll be the middle cerebral artery which is involved. Whereas if it is paralysis of the legs or the feet or the perineal area, there's some problem there, then it is the anterior cerebral. So again, it's important to correlate all of these these different, the blood supply with the functional areas. So again, if there's the auditory cortex is affected, then you can see that again it'll be middle cerebral. So make sure you kind of realize and know this. So look at these images very, very carefully and then relate them with the functional areas. This is, of course, the Berry's aneurysm seen in the circle of Willis. This is about subarachnoid hemorrhage. And then here, when we are doing the venous drainage, you must know how these veins are formed, where they drain into, where they are present. For example, the superior sagittal sinus up here is present along the upper border of the falx cerebri, the inferior sagittal along the lower border. Then you must know how they form the transverse sinus, and that leads to the sigmoid. So, formation is extremely important. And again, pay attention to this. Notice how this is the inferior sagittal sinus up here, this one, and that joins with the great cerebral vein, and that forms a straight sinus. So, you must know how they are formed and what continues as the right, what continues as the left transverse sinus, what that leads into, and then how it goes into the internal jugular vein. At the same time, notice the cavernous sinus. And I think the next picture probably shows you here the cavernous sinus. You must know its relations, what structures lie either within it or in its walls, what it drains into. So these are important things in the blood supply. Let's look at the cerebrum. Here, of course, you must know the different sulci that are important, which I've mentioned, how the lobes of the brain are divided. So you must know which lobe lies in front, which lobe lies behind, which sulcus or is related to which sulcus. So you can see the central sulcus, and then you should know all the different gyri, which I have mentioned. Again, things like, the corpus callosum, the different parts, which part is close to which pole of the cerebral hemisphere. So here you're looking at the different lobes and then the sulci. So you can see that the central sulcus separates the motor from the sensory cortex, or also you can see the precentral from the postcentral gyri. So the questions could be given differently. Also know where these again functional areas are lying. You must also know, as you can see here, which if you look here, you can see the lateral ventricle. So which horn of the ventricle or which part of the ventricle lies in relation to which lobe of the brain. So that is important. Here we are looking at the sulci and the gyri. So again, I cannot stress the importance. You must know their functional importance. So you must know the functional importance. You must know if it is separated from another one by any sulcus, so the relationship to sulci. So you must know the relationship to sulci, and of course the names of the gyri for the functional areas. For example, superior temporal gyrus is this one is it contains the auditory area. The precentral is the motor cortex. Similarly, the cuneus, for example, is the visual cortex. The calcarine sulcus has the visual area. Little things like that are extremely important in the sulci. And again, you must know the blood supply. So right here itself, if you put it, you can see that the middle cerebral artery would be somewhat like this, and this area up here would be the anterior cerebral, this is middle cerebral, and this part is the posterior cerebral. So draw it for yourselves and see how these areas are supplied by blood. Then again, these are of course the same thing, the sulci and gyri. So know the important ones, the ones that I have mentioned. In the Brodmann's areas, you must know what is the basis of how Brodmann's areas came about. You should also know some important ones like, the Broca's area, the auditory cortex, the motor and the sensory cortex, the visual area and the associated area. You should also know about the homunculus. So, how the body is represented and what is the meaning of homunculus. So those are important things. Here in the cortical areas, you should know about these pyramidal cells and what those giant pyramidal cells are called and where they are present. So you must know where these cells are present. And then up here again, notice these areas, and the important Brodmann's areas I have labeled, and you should know about them. Area 17 was the primary visual cortex, so you should know about these. Know where these areas are present. Functions, of course, you have to know the different functions, and I've gone over them in detail, so you must know about the functions of each lobe. You should be able to tell the difference between expressive speech and receptive speech, and you must know that, because if you get a case about expressive or receptive, you should be able to identify which area is damaged. So here we're looking at all the areas, so you should know all of these, and I've kind of given you an idea what really happens and how the patient presents, so listen to that carefully. This was a little bit extra that was given. Again, these are all functions, so important to know all of these functions. Then you must know about the types of fibers: commissural, association, and projection, what they connect, if there is any special areas they are present in, or any special names, you should know about them. Like for example here, you should know about these examples of these types of fibers. And in association fibers, how you speak the written word, what is the order in which the impulses go, which lobes are involved, that is important, as is speaking the heard word. Again, you must know what is the pathway, so that's extremely important. In hemispherical dominance, what you really need to know is what's given in your notes. In other words, how do you say which hemisphere is dominant? What is it based on? Things that I've mentioned in my narration. These little things I won't ask you on, that a person with the right hemisphere, does he or doesn't he gesticulate while speaking? These are not things that I'll ask you, but what is there in your notes and what other things I've mentioned in the narration are important. If you know the functions, you obviously will know lesions. So again, it's important to know that. You must know these different terms like aphasia, apraxia, agnosia. Again, like I said, you should know the difference between receptive and expressive aphasia. Very important to know that. And then if you know the functions, you will automatically be able to, given a case, you'll be able to identify where the lesion lies. Again, this is about the lesions. And then Alzheimer's disease, you must know little things about Alzheimer's, what happens, what neurotransmitter is affected, which areas are affected, and what are some of the main signs and symptoms you see in Alzheimer's disease.